All right, I think we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Grace Hayek, and on behalf of the Glencoe Public Library, I welcome you to our program, Monet and Chicago. We're delighted to present a slide lecture by art historian Catherine Kremnitzer, who's joining us from New York. The library is grateful to the Babette Takeoff Fund for supporting tonight's event. Thank you very much. You're invited to put your questions into the chat, and I will ask them on your behalf when Catherine ends her presentation. Before we get started, I'm going to put a one-question poll up on the screen so that we can get an idea of how many viewers we have tonight. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. Okay. Well, again, thank you for being here tonight. And let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Catherine joined the Art Institute staff in 2018 as a research associate in the Painting and Sculpture of Europe department. She works on 19th century French painting exhibitions and on the permanent collection. She received her PhD in art history from Columbia University this spring with a dissertation on Edouard Manet, and was part of the curatorial team responsible for the exhibit Manet and Modern Beauty, which was on view last spring. She's a contributing author to the catalog for Monet and Chicago, which opened in September and still can be extensively explored online while the museum is closed. Tonight, she'll give you an overview of the exhibition and share some behind the scenes. Catherine, welcome, and please go ahead.
Grace, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for this invitation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. It's great to see some familiar faces. And of course, I'm so happy to collaborate with the Glencoe Public Library. So the Monet in Chicago exhibition really is quite a unique story. It's the first ever exhibition to consider the relationship between Monet and the city of Chicago. And it really is a city and a relationship of many firsts. So Chicagoans were among the first Americans to buy paintings by Monet. The Art Institute was the first museum in the country to give Monet a solo exhibition. And we were also the first museum to buy one of his paintings. And today, with 33 paintings and 13 works on paper in the collection, we have the largest collection of works by Monet outside of Paris. So lots to boast about. And some of you may have hoped, like us last spring, to pick up this stack of wheat for your own collection. Whenever you see estimate upon request at an auction house, it's usually not a good sign. And like us, you were surely disappointed not to have the over $110 million needed to bring this painting home. But even though it's not in our galleries, it has a lot to do with our early history. In fact, if we look at the provenance, so in other words, the history of who's owned the painting, we'll see lots of names that by the end of this talk certainly will be more familiar to you, beginning with Paul Durand-Ruel, Monet's primary dealer. So the artist gave this canvas just a few months after he'd finished it to his dealer, who sold it to the Palmers, Chicago collectors, who rather quickly gave it back to the dealer and some months later repurchased the painting. Now, this habit of buying and selling paintings in quick succession is something that we see often in the Palmers collecting, and we think it's a habit that might have grown out of this return policy that Potter Palmer had invented for his dry goods store. So I'm showing you a cover of the Chicago Tribune from the 1870s, I believe. And what you see at the bottom of this advertisement for the store is a notice that says, quote, "Purchases made at my establishment that prove unsatisfactory either in price, quality, or style can be returned to the cashier's desk, for which the purchase money will be with pleasure returned." So Potter Palmer was one of Chicago's wealthiest business magnates. He was also one of the city's largest landholders. And his wife, Bertha Palmer, was no shrinking violet. She was the queen of Chicago high society and the self-proclaimed hostess to the nation. And together they were extraordinarily shrewd collectors. They came to own almost 90 paintings by Monet, 90, including these 9 stacks of wheat, 4 of which, in fact, are now in the Art Institute's collection, including the very first painting from the series that came to the museum. And the Art Institute owns 6 of the approximately 25 paintings that make up the Stacks of Wheat series, which is really quite extraordinary because not only are we able to exhibit all of them together, often in our permanent collection gallery, as you see them here, and of course in the exhibition, but we're showing them in the way that Monet intended. He made them as a series and he exhibited them as a series, which he did for the first time in May 1891 at Durand Ruel's gallery in Paris. Now, we don't have any photographs from that early installation, so I'm showing you here a kind of mock-up of what it might have been like to experience these canvases, all of which are variations on a singular motif in succession, one after the other. What we do have is a brochure of the exhibition, and there you see the 15 paintings from the series that were exhibited. And the key word here in French is meule, for stack. So the 15 paintings share very similar, if not the same titles, which make it a little bit difficult to know which was where and even which was included. But what we do know is that Bertha Palmer was in Paris in the spring of 1891. And in fact, she saw the exhibition. And by the end of that summer, she'd purchased 2 paintings from the series. And by the end of the following year, she'd acquired another 3. So just within a year of their production, they were still extremely contemporary art in their day. She had acquired 5 of the 25 Stacks of Wheat. She was really an extraordinarily avant-garde collector. And she sought to preserve Monet's intentions in exhibiting these paintings as a series in her own collecting practices. And we'll see some more about that later. But believe it or not, in the months leading up to the exhibition, Monet was extremely anxious, which is a characteristic that runs throughout his correspondence. And I want to read an excerpt from a letter that he wrote, again, just a few weeks before the show opened, to his friend, the art critic Gustave Geoffroy, who you see pictured there. So he writes, "I'm grinding away, struggling stubbornly with a series of different effects, but at this time of year, the sun sinks so fast that I can't keep up with it. I'm beginning to work so slowly that I despair, but the longer I go on, the more I see that it is necessary to work a great deal in order to succeed in rendering what I seek, the same light spreading everywhere. And more than ever, I'm disgusted with things that come easily in one go. I am more and more obsessed by the need to render what I experience." Now, rendering his experience was not as straightforward as it seems. In fact, it was quite a complicated process. And what I'm showing you here are the 6 stacks of wheat in the Art Institute's collection, each of which is annotated in red with compositional changes that are observable beneath the surface, thanks to varying lighting conditions. So for example, if we look at this painting in the collection in infrared, which you see here, we notice that there was a second stack in this composition that's outlined again here in red that Monet decided to paint out of the final composition. And he would do things like this, changing the number of stacks in a painting. He would also do something quite sneaky. Now we know that Monet began these paintings outside in a field adjacent to his property at Giverny, and he would then take the canvases back to his studio to revise them individually and in keeping with the series as a whole. And here, we think that Monet probably began this painting in summer, because when we look at it under the microscope, so I'm showing you a detail taken under high magnification, we see beneath that layer of white paint, green, which indicates to us he probably started the painting in summer, but only finished it in winter, by which time he added that blanket of snow. So he changed not only the number of stacks, but also the season in this case. Very sneaky. And we have actually in the exhibition in gallery, this incredible video that we collaborated with our paintings conservation team to produce that invites you to experience 3 of Monet's series paintings in person and in this kind of immersive way. And I'll give you at the end of this little behind the scenes, all of the links so that you can see these videos online, which of course now we've tried to make as much of the exhibition available as we possibly can, including 2 other videos that focus again on conservation, looking at 2 of the earliest paintings by Monet in the collection. So I highly encourage you to explore the exhibition online if you're interested. But you might be asking yourself, when did Monet's work first arrive in Chicago? Well, Monet's paintings were first shown in the city in the late 1880s, and Duran Ruel was successful in organizing group shows at various galleries throughout the city, including Thurber's Art Gallery. I'm showing you here a review of the exhibition where Monet's paintings are picked out as, quote, the most fascinating among them. A few months later, Monet was included in another group exhibition of, quote, foreign pictures. And the reviewer here quips at the end, why go to Paris since Paris has come to Chicago? So already Chicagoans were setting the taste not only in the United States, but even abroad. And all the while, a really precocious woman named Sarah Tyson Hallowell, a Chicagoan, was taking stock of this avant-garde group in Paris and mobilizing to show their work in the city of Chicago and to bring them to the United States. Now, she was responsible for organizing an art exhibition that was part of these interstate industrial expositions that occurred annually in the city of Chicago beginning in 1873. The last of these fairs, which was actually on the site that the Art Institute now occupies on Michigan Avenue, featured an exhibition of 20 paintings brought over by Duran Ruel. And we know that the paintings by Monet in this exhibition, which many collectors saw, kind of set the tone for what Chicago collectors were looking to acquire in subsequent years. These fairs were a way for Chicago to show itself as a kind of cosmopolitan hub, especially as it had been rebuilding in the decades after the Great Fire of 1871. So with the last of these expositions came great excitement for the Columbian World's Exposition of 1893. And I'm showing you here a kind of bird's eye view of the fairgrounds. And in fact, Bertha Palmer was president of the board of lady managers. She was responsible for erecting the Women's Building, which you see there on the right. And she spent years traveling Europe, with many trips to Paris, trying to drum up excitement for this exposition. Now, the fair featured a fine arts building, which included an exhibition of fine art, including paintings from 129 private collections in the United States. And this exhibition was organized by Hallowell, and it included these 4 paintings by Monet. And Hallowell, in a letter from Paris to Potter Palmer, who was also a key member in organizing the exposition, she writes in this letter of her, quote, ambition to make that gallery of French pictures owned in America surpass what is sent from here, in other words, from France. So she was really determined to demonstrate that American collecting interests, or at least her own, were more sophisticated and highly cultivated than those in France, where Monet and the group of artists that became known as the Impressionists were still not entirely accepted by the official academic salon system. And in addition to her civic-minded responsibilities, Hallowell also served as the Palmers' private art advisor. And it's thanks to her that they went on to collect such incredible works by Impressionist artists, beginning with this pastel by Degas, which is now in our collection. Now, as I mentioned, the Palmers had been kind of scouring Europe to get people excited about the exposition and to invite them to Chicago in 1893. I'm showing you just a collection of headlines from newspapers all over the world that document their goings on, where they were going, who they were seeing, often what Mrs. Palmer is wearing. So they really were kind of celebrities on the move. And back in Chicago, they had built this extremely modest residence. As you can see, it was known in its own day as the Castle on North Lakeshore Drive in the area of Chicago now known as the Gold Coast. This was the largest private residence in Chicago at the time, and it was enlarged by Bertha Palmer in 1892 looking ahead to the fair and the thousands of guests that she would welcome through her home. And she added this 90-foot combination picture gallery and ballroom that you see there beyond the columns. And if you look left, just behind that enormous urn, that's our Petite Creuse, a painting by Monet that was in the Palmer collection and ultimately made it to the museum. So with the close of the fair in December 1893, the Art Institute opened on Michigan Avenue, of course, where we are today, in a building that had been constructed in cooperation with the city for the fair. And just 2 years later, in 1895, we would be the first museum in the United States to host a solo exhibition of Monet's work. So I'm showing you on the left a letter from Durand Ruel to the Art Institute's then president, listing the 20 paintings at right that were being shipped to Chicago for the exhibition. And I want to draw your attention to one in particular, which is called Le Jardin here, the garden. We know it better as Apple Trees in Blossom. This painting, in fact, was purchased from the exhibition by an Art Institute trustee who was also a member of the newly formed Union League Club of Chicago. So this painting is, in fact, the first painting to be acquired by a Chicago institution by Monet. And supposedly the club paid $500 for it. And the then president of the club scoffed something like, "Who would pay $500 for that blob of paint?" Well, this is probably the best money that the club ever spent. And I'm sure many of you have seen in the last week that the club, because of the climate and the circumstances that they find themselves in financially, are now considering selling this painting, which is really quite a tragedy because it has so much to do with our history and unique relationship with Monet. But just a few years after that first exhibition, the Art Institute, again leading the way in the United States, would be the first museum to purchase one of Monet's paintings. We bought Bad Weather Pourville in 1903, so not even 10 years after the painting was made, and again, when it was still very much contemporary art. Monet was not a household name yet, and we were really on the forefront of collecting what was then very modern. And our Monet holdings were really first augmented by the Palmer's bequest in 1922, which included all of these paintings by Monet, most of which remain in the collection today. But the Palmers were not the only collectors to take an early interest in Monet. I'm showing you here a photograph of Martin A. Ryerson, who was a longtime trustee of the museum, served on its board as vice president, and together with his wife, Carrie, became amongst the most generous donors in the museum's history. He also was purchasing Impressionist work quite early. He bought his first painting by Monet in 1891 from Paul Durand Ruel in New York. And together with his wife, they would come to own 17 paintings by the artist. And what's really fun about Ryerson is we have many, if not all, of his purchase receipts, which give us a sense of his greater collecting interest. So here on this ticket for several Impressionist paintings, we see Monet listed among Sisley and other artists. Of course, the Monet, which we looked at a little bit earlier, is the most expensive of all the paintings on the ticket. At $1,500, it accounts for nearly half of the entire bill of $35.50. And Ryerson, like the Palmers, was playing this game of exchange. So here we have a receipt where Ryerson returned a Renoir for this Charing Cross Bridge, and another receipt that lists 3 paintings by Monet purchased in one go, including this really stunning early square water lilies, which we know in fact lived in Carrie Ryerson's bedroom. And I know with the glare, it's a little bit hard to see, but you'll have to take my word for it that it was hanging very prominently across from her bed in their Drexel Boulevard residence on the south side of Chicago. Now, the Ryersons, like the Palmers, I should say, actually met Monet. The Palmers had met Monet at the opening of a Renoir exhibition in Paris, it just so happens. But the Ryersons made a pilgrimage to Giverny, where the artist would spend the last decades of his life and work to cultivate not only his paintings, but also these extraordinary gardens that you can still visit today. And what's so fun is that we have these photographs documenting the Ryersons' trip. So you can see in the upper right corner, Ryerson walking with the artist. And in the bottom right corner, Mrs. Ryerson, who's wearing a fur in June. I can't quite explain that. But it's just so fun to see these pictures that are part of a family photo album that are in the exhibition and of course available online. And there in the upper right-hand corner, you see Monet's famous water lily pond. And I just wanted to show you this video of Monet painting at the pond's edge, of course, very staged. But the water lily pond really became an obsession that sustained the last 2 decades of Monet's career, both in terms of the maintenance and the creation of the pond, but also as a subject for his paintings, as you can see. And in 1908, Monet again wrote to his friend Geoffroy, quote, "These landscapes of water and reflections have become an obsession. It's quite beyond my powers at my age, and yet I want to succeed in rendering what I feel." So still that interest in capturing his experience somehow in paint. Now in total, Monet would make over 300 paintings of what he called his most beautiful masterpiece, the water lily pond, some of which expanded, as you can see here, to room-sized panels that even stretched across multiple panels and culminated in what he called les grandes décorations, in other words, the large decorations, this site-specific installation that he gifted to the French state with the end of World War I, that quite sadly were installed just months after he died. So they went up in 1927, he died in 1926, and still to this day, they're some of the most extraordinary galleries in the world at the Orangerie in Paris. When the Ryersons went to Giverny, they were there really on official museum business. And I'm showing you an article in a French newspaper at the time that mentions some Chicago resident who'd visited Monet and was hoping to buy 30 paintings by the artist, 30, from this water lily series. Now, Monet was not selling yet, and it wouldn't be until the 1950s, in fact, that the Art Institute would acquire one of these late, large, experimental canvases by the artist. And up to this point, I should mention, the 31 paintings that were in the Art Institute collection were all given as gifts, which is really quite extraordinary. And it was thanks to another pioneering woman curator, Catherine Koo, who was then in charge of modern art, that the Art Institute was able to purchase irises, which I've just shown you. We already had a robust collection of paintings by Monet, but she recognized the significance and the importance of showing the entirety of Monet's career. So not just early and middle career works, but also things from his last years. So Monet, believe it or not, when he died in 1926, left hundreds of paintings languishing in his studio, and many of them were actually damaged by shrapnel in World War II. So by the time they were rediscovered in the 1950s by one of his sons, there really wasn't quite an understanding of his late career, but very quickly there was an interest in acquiring these paintings, so much so that, in fact, MoMA in New York was also trying to buy this painting, but it was thanks to Catherine Koo's persistence that we won out and it came to Chicago. Now, I don't know if anybody's been binge watching The Crown. I definitely was. So you'd be tickled to know that on a visit to the United States, the only official stop was in Chicago en route to Canada. And there's Queen Elizabeth II, of course, walking through our Monet galleries with this magisterial irises painting behind them and Catherine Koo kind of looking on, making sure everything is okay. The last collector I want to talk about briefly is Annie Swan Coburn, and I'm showing you a photograph of her here in her Chicago apartment at the Blackstone Hotel, which still stands just a few blocks south of the museum today. Now, we actually know quite a deal less about Mrs. Coburn, but we do have these incredible photographs that show you the rather eclectic way she lived with her collection. I can understand being from New York when you're tight on space in an apartment. So we have here hanging in the center Water Lily Pond, and I can't resist pointing out the Manet to its right, Manet Woman Reading, that was in our exhibition last spring. In another corner of the apartment, I think resting on a footstool there, we have Cliff Walk at Pourville. And then again, in another space, 2 Monets hanging prominently on the wall. In 1932, in fact, the Art Institute gave an exhibition of Mrs. Coburn's collection, but very sadly, during the run of the exhibition, Mrs. Coburn died, leaving over 100 works of art to the museum, including all of these paintings by Monet, again, several of which still remain in the collection. Monet was also included in the landmark Century of Progress exhibitions, held first in 1933 and, due to popular demand, brought back for 1934. In 1975, the Art Institute gave Monet a solo exhibition, and again, which some of you may have seen, in 1995. Now I'm showing you an aerial view of the line outside the museum to get in to see this exhibition. We welcomed over 1 million visitors. To this day, it remains the most popularly attended exhibition in the museum's history. And for anybody that was watching The Last Dance and reliving, all the excitement of Michael Jordan and the Bulls, it really is pretty funny to think that Monet was the hottest ticket in town, as published in the Chicago Tribune. And we know this to be true. This is an example from the classifieds of the Chicago Tribune, and you can see all of these advertisements for Monet tickets for sale alongside the Bulls, Green Day, and of course my personal favorite, Bruce Springsteen. So Monet was pretty cool. In the interim, we were able to acquire some other paintings, including 3 more stacks of wheat, one of which we purchased, which brings us up to our total of 6 stacks of wheat in the collection. And the latest addition to the collection is a promised gift from Art Institute trustee Marian Phelps Pollock, which will bring our total number of paintings up to 34. Very exciting. And all of our Monet holdings are featured in this online scholarly catalog that was an enormous undertaking between the curators of our department and our colleagues in conservation, both paintings and paper conservation scientists. This catalog is fully explorable online. It was published in 2014. And in addition to art historical essays, you have these interactive technical reports that feature images that allow you to see the painting in various lighting conditions. So for example, here in X-ray, also in infrared. And in looking at the painting in these different conditions, we can see compositional changes beneath the surface. So you see those figures standing right on the shore that Monet ultimately painted out. We can also zoom in to see the paintings closer than ever before. And again, looking at a different view, we notice ships in the distance that meant that Monet also painted out and some figures sitting on the shore there. Instead, Monet chose to focus this composition on the fishermen at left and hone in on aspects of working local life that he probably knew best, having grown up in a town not so far from Saint-Adresse. We also have details of the composition, including its materials, notes about the canvas, the kinds of paints he's using, even what brushes. We have lots of close-up views of areas of the composition that have interesting or noteworthy elements, whether they're compositional changes or other kinds of inclusions. We also have an annotated provenance. So again, the history of who's owned the painting, also an exhibition history and a bibliographic reference. So this is really an extraordinary resource accessible online for free for art students and lovers alike. So I highly encourage you to explore that at your leisure on a computer. And what else is exciting about the exhibition is that we can show our caricatures by Monet. So you might be thinking to yourself, I didn't know Monet did caricature. Most people don't, and that's because we don't think of him as a draftsman. But in fact, the Art Institute has more of the caricatures by Monet than any other institution in the world. And I love these works. I think they're hilarious. They're probably the earliest works of art for which Monet was ever paid. He made them when he was about 17. And they were kind of commissions, right? And what's cool about them is that we've learned by looking at them with conservators that in fact, what looks like a beige paper was actually blue. And on the left, you can really see this quite clearly, that the area that was exposed in the window mat when the drawing was framed has turned a different color. And the true original color of the paper, at least closer to it, that blue, is on the edges, which was covered by the mat. So a chemical change has occurred that's altered the color of the paper. And I think with that blue paper, those highlights in white and other kind of things that look a little bit garish now would have been kind of toned down. Again, you can read all about that online in that scholarly catalog. And this is the first time actually that they're all on view, so it's very exciting. You can also listen if you like to the audio tour, which picks out a few highlights from the exhibition. It features me, Gloria Groom, the curator of the exhibition, as well as a paintings conservator, Kim Muir, who knows these paintings better than anybody else. And I think one of the most exciting things about the exhibition is that you're able to encounter beloved favorites from our collection interspersed with very generous loans from Chicagoland collectors. So I'm showing you all of the paintings that we've welcomed from friends of the museum and people who live in the area. And it fills out our own holdings. So not only can we show you landscapes across time and place from Monet's career, including in the bottom center there, a park in Paris that features a very tiny portrait of his family. And here at top center, a more robust portrait of Monet's family. This painting was actually owned by the American artist John Singer Sargent, and then entered one of our early Chicago collectors' collections and is now again on loan to us, which is very exciting. We also have lots of still lifes by Monet. Again, you might not think of that as a genre that he pursued, but listen, when it's raining, you still got to make art and you got to eat, right? So still life was a genre that was profitable for him and also a subject that he could really control. We have snowscapes from his trip to Norway, also a stormy scene from Belle Ile there on the bottom left, and of course, the beloved water lilies, which is the last gallery of the exhibition and really quite a sacred space that I hope those of you who've not yet seen the exhibition will get to enjoy as soon as we're able to reopen. All of the works in the exhibition are featured in our catalog, which is available online for purchase. The cover that you're seeing there is a 1-to-1 scale detail of one of our water lily paintings. So the reproductions here are just breathtakingly beautiful. And I want to play a clip of audio from one of our Chicago lenders who tells you much better than I can about this special relationship that Chicago has with Monet, even still today. So we'll see if this works.
My name is Mark Novak. I have lived in Chicago for approximately 40 years. And the reason that I'm being interviewed today is because I am an art collector, but more particularly, I am a collector of Monet. Collectors often, by purchasing young artists' work, can provide an economic means by which those artists can continue to have their careers flourish. And then secondly, collectors, by lending their works to exhibitions or to museums, certainly allows the general public to see paintings they otherwise would not see, and to make sure that those paintings aren't closeted away in somebody's home as some trophy piece. The fact that the Art Institute of Chicago has amassed the most significant collection of Monet outside of Paris, that if you want to see Monet in the United States, you come to Chicago. I think that reflects not only greatly upon our city, but it obviously is a wonderful venue for people around the country, around the world, to say, hey, let's go to Chicago to see Monet.
And so in that the museum, again, is closed to the public until further notice, I just want to direct your attention to opportunities to explore the exhibition further online. So we have here an overview that allows you to walk gallery by gallery through the exhibition, as well as some blog posts. One focuses on those early collectors that we touched on today. Another very exciting post on the actual water lilies that Monet was buying for his garden. On the left there, we have a list of his purchase, a kind of receipt. In fact, you can still buy the same species that Monet kind of special ordered for his garden. And I have another detail there of our water lilies painting that just shows you one of those gorgeous flowers up close. And I have to say that an exhibition is the result of extraordinary teamwork across many departments in the museum and of course colleagues really worldwide, especially during a pandemic. It was an incredible team effort. And these are just some of my colleagues that helped bring the exhibition to life in person and online. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this little tour of Monet in Chicago, and I welcome any questions you might have about the exhibition.
All right, let me find my audio. Where am I?
On.
There we are. Okay. Thank you, Catherine. That really took us away, I think, from 2020. And thank you for that. All right, we have a few questions in the chat. And let's see. Oh, here's someone who wants to know, how much would a Monet painting cost in the late 1800s?
Excellent question. So to put things in perspective, when Monet first exhibited the stacks of wheat in 1891, they were each on sale for 3,000 francs, which is roughly equivalent to $500. So they've appreciated enormously. But they were still considered expensive, of course, in their own day, and buying art was certainly a luxury. So it's kind of hard to think about the value across time, but as a baseline, the stacks, which were being sold at a moment, really when Monet was just kind of breaching superstardom, they were going for about $500 each.
Thank you. Norwood from Memphis wants to know, were his paintings all painted on stretched canvas? And if so, did he stretch his own canvases or buy them from someone?
What an astute question. And I hope you have a chance to explore the online catalog, because in fact, we have notes on all of his materials, including the canvases. And believe it or not, there's a really wonderful scientist at Cornell University, actually, who's been able to do canvas thread counting. So basically you take an X-ray of the painting and you very carefully count the number of threads in the weave, has to do with the warp and the weft, and you can then match up canvases together to know what came from the same bolt. Well, we've done that with all of our paintings, and it's fascinating to see which actual canvases came from the same roll of canvas. So in other words, Monet was definitely buying supplies from an art supplies merchant. He was also buying pre-manufactured paints at this point. Sometimes he's stretching his own canvas, especially if he would cut something and kind of manipulate the size, but I think almost all of the paintings I've shown you are very standard size canvases, so he's buying them pre-stretched. But we have amazing content online about maker's marks and stamps on the back of canvases. When he was in London, he had to buy some supplies in England, so there's a really fascinating history on very material lines.
Next question, when was Catherine Koo involved?
So Catherine Koo was a curator of modern art in the 50s and I think up through the 60s. She's really a fascinating character. She started out in New York, I think, actually, and made her way to Chicago, but she was just extremely prescient in her collecting interests. As I mentioned, we'd already had tens of examples by Monet in the collection, and yet she understood the importance of having a comprehensive collection of an artist as important as Monet. And I should mention that so many of the modern artists that were contemporary in her own day, Jackson Pollock, all the way up to Rothko, and certainly artists today, looked to Monet, and in particular to those late paintings that were just kind of getting scholarly and public attention in the 50s. So it's really interesting to think about somebody like Pollock and Monet's own extremely abstract, really immersive paintings. And I think she was kind of tapping into that.
Jill wants to know, has AIC deaccessioned, I guess, any Monet or other Impressionist paintings?
Yes, in fact, we have. It's a practice that we hope not to have to engage in really ever again, although these are precarious times, and I'm sure you've seen other museums in the country considering those kinds of moves for financial reasons. But some of the paintings I showed you today that were gifted to the museum and ultimately deaccessioned from the collection, that really happened in the 40s after World War II. We had a few kind of, I hate to use the word fire sales, but instances where we had to cull the collection just to stay afloat. So it's true that we did deaccession some paintings by Monet and other Impressionists and Old Masters.
Norwood wants to know, who chooses the framing?
Another great question. So all of the works that came from private collections come as they are framed. But again, if you look on the online scholarly catalog, we have notes on the frames of all of our paintings, and some of our Monet paintings are in what we call original frames. And what that means is they're in the frame that Durand-Ruel put on the paintings when they were first exhibited, whenever, whether it was the 1890s or a little bit later. So it's really extraordinary. And you can see all of those notes online. Each of the paintings has an entry by our frame conservator, who's just extraordinarily knowledgeable in the history of frames, which is a whole history unto itself. And if you study them online, when you go see the exhibition in person, you'll know what to look for to spot the Durand-Ruel frames. And you can tell which ones are then fake imitation Durand-Ruel frames. It's a fun kind of I Spy.
Ron would like to know what was the most surprising part of your research for this exhibition?
I think one of the most pleasant surprises of the exhibition actually was this narrative of women, incredible Chicago women who were either really forward thinking in their collecting, or Sarah Tyson Hallowell, this kind of proto-curator of the 1890s, you know, Bertha Palmer, of course, Carrie Ryerson, Annie Coburn, Catherine Koo, all the way up to the curator of this exhibition, my boss, Gloria Groom, who's been at the Art Institute for some 3 decades now. It's just extraordinary to see this leadership on the part of women, you know, beginning in the 1890s all the way to today. So that was a really pleasant surprise in the archive.
Next question, would the Art Institute consider purchasing the Monet from the Union League Club?
Listen, if you want to talk about it and get it together, I am down. We would love to get that painting. On a more serious note, it is a difficult time to acquire, of course, but it's really unclear, I think, what will happen with that painting. As far as I know from the press, it sounds like the board has voted to sell the painting if necessary. But if anybody wants to buy it and give it to the museum, you'd be our best friend for life. So.
For sure. Is it available to the public to see, or do you have to be a club member?
That's a good question. I think it might be available to the public to see, or perhaps you can make an appointment. I mean, they have a large collection of art. I know it usually hangs, I believe, on the 2nd floor. And of course, now it's on view in the exhibition. But that's a good question. I'm not quite sure.
Joel wants to know, why are Impressionists so popular? Is this a Chicago thing?
That's another great question. I think, you know, Chicagoans, as I mentioned, were in the 1870s and 80s rebuilding after really a devastating fire that destroyed not only an entire swath of the city, of course, left hundreds of thousands homeless, but they had this kind of hunger to make themselves into a world-class city. And I think part of that witnessed the founding of these, you know, social, cultural institutions, including museums. And the Impressionists, because they weren't really so well received in France, were kind of a good buy in the United States. You know, it was a lot cheaper to buy a Monet than a Rembrandt, for example. So I think the impetus to collect Impressionist art in that moment was something really new, accessible, affordable, different, interesting, kind of edgy. And today, it's funny, I think Impressionism has almost the total opposite effect with people, or a kind of very different connotation. It's something very pleasant and accepted and familiar. So I don't know. It's a funny thing. And it's true that we like to say Monet is in our DNA in Chicago. And of course, the Impressionist collection at the Art Institute is world renowned. So there's something in the water in Chicago about Impressionism.
Someone would like you to share the links again. Is that a slide that you could put up?
You know what? I can also pop them in the chat. How's that?
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay.
Although the slide might be better for people who might be watching on their phones or something.
Okay. Let me try that. I hope I won't make you nauseous. Ooh, well, this is a fun behind the scenes. That's what the gallery looked like in July before we'd finished construction. Some of you might know that the exhibition was set to open on Mother's Day, and we had to open in September because of the closure. But it was incredible. We went from this to this, and to the final presentation that you eventually saw in very quick succession. Here we are hanging the show. So if nobody gets nauseous, I'm sorry, but I'll do that thing where you go backwards to the links. So sorry. So that's the audio tour, but maybe I'll leave you with the catalog. So it's arctic.edu/digital Monet. And to get to the exhibition page, it's arctic.edu/Monet. And of course, you can always Google Art Institute of Chicago Monet, and you'll find all of these goodies online.
Thank you.
Sure.
Joyce asks, you had mentioned that the museum had about 8 Monet paintings in a category and now has less than that. Why would the museum reduce the size of its collection? Perhaps that's the I'm not sure.
That to me sounds a little bit like the deaccessioning question.
Of the 40s, yeah.
I think
I think you did talk about that, so perhaps that's what she's referring to. Another framing question. Vicky asks, do you know if Monet developed friendships with his collectors or if he preferred to leave all of the selling to Durand Ruel?
That's an excellent question. So we know in the case of the Palmers and the Ryersons that they had a personal connection, that they'd met in Europe, in Paris and in Giverny. I should mention that despite Durand Ruel's consistent urging, Monet never came to the United States, let alone to Chicago. But he did have at times a direct relationship with Chicago collectors and American collectors. Of course, the Impressionist artist, an American who was also an extraordinary art agent, Mary Cassatt, had a direct relationship with Monet, and she facilitated sales primarily to the Havemeyers, who were in large part responsible for the collection of Impressionist work and other unbelievable paintings at the Met. So he had a relationship with Sarah Hallowell through correspondence and in person, but he did famously say and complain often, actually, to Durand Ruel that his paintings were going to the land of the Yankees. And I think he was at first kind of disappointed that he had such a market in America, but still was, considered with a lot of skepticism in his home country. Of course, by the end of his life, he was accepted as a kind of national hero, and is in large part, I think, why Impressionism is synonymous with France. But more and more today, we're interested in and learning about a kind of international Impressionism and Impressionisms in Australia and all these other places. So it's a funny thing, his disappointment that pictures were going to the United States, and yet it was sustaining his livelihood. So
sounds like friends of yours, Betsy and Alan, they're here, and they want to know if you could meet Monet in person, what would you ask him? What would be the first question?
Oh my gosh. Well, I have to say, I'm partial to Manet, but I've learned to love both of them. So I think I would want to know so much about Manet and his relationship with Manet. I will say that Manet died at 53 in 1883, so Monet way outlived him. But it's because of Monet that Manet was recognized, again, as a national hero, really only at his death. And in fact, Monet was one of the pallbearers at Manet's funeral, and he also organized a subscription to buy Manet's Olympia for the French state. So I'd be so curious to know about their friendship and what that was like. So I guess that's a kind of evasive answer, but yeah.
Steve wants to know, how old was Monet when he was able to make a living as an artist, and did he come from an artistic family?
Good question. He really struggled financially for much of his life and career. Many times, almost regularly, he's asking his dealer Durand Ruel for money, and it's thanks to Durand Ruel alone that he was able to purchase his property at Giverny. But he was selling pretty consistently throughout his life. And by the end, he was pretty comfortable. He was able to build, I think it's 3 studios at the end, all increasing in size to accommodate those enormous water lily canvases. So let's see, he started exhibiting with the Impressionists in 1874. And by the 1890s, he's really selling pretty consistently through Durand Ruel and some other dealers, not only in Paris, but in London and in New York. So it took a while and he really struggled, but by the end, he was quite comfortable.
Did he ever visit Chicago?
No, he never came to the United States, but he did travel quite a bit. I mean, he had a stepson who lived in Norway, and I showed you a few of the private collection paintings that he did there. He went in winter and was painting outside in the cold. He writes back to his wife, his second wife, Alice Hochedé, something like, "You would laugh if you could see me. There's icicles dripping from my beard." So he went to Italy once with Renoir and then by himself. He traveled all over France. He spent some time in London, of course, Venice. So, but never the United States, maybe out of spite. I'm not sure. It also must have been a really long journey by boat. So
here's the question on a lot of our minds. Will the exhibit be extended beyond its current run?
I hope so. It's a single venue exhibition. Given the specificity of the thesis around Chicago, we're the only museum to host the show. It's unclear right now when we'll reopen. We're following state orders and listening to Governor Pritzker, but as soon as we're able to open, we certainly hope to present this exhibition to you. And I have to say, it's been extraordinarily heartwarming to see Chicagoans especially because our audiences have been so local, embrace this exhibition. So it's something we hope to continue to share with you in person.
Jessica wants to know who purchased the Monet paintings in the Barnes collection?
Excellent question. The answer is Mr. Barnes, unless I'm misunderstanding your question and it's a trick question. But yeah, the Monets in the Barnes collection were purchased by Barnes and remain in the Barnes collection. The history of that collection is fascinating. I think every law student, there's like a 101 class where you talk about his will, because it's been so violated by moving to this beautiful new building kind of associated with the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I think there's a great documentary about the Barnes collection called The Art of the Steal. Really fun to watch.
We have that at the library, and yeah, it's
good.
really, really good.
Really good.
Yeah. Here's someone who wants to know, did Monet speak English well? Did the Palmers, et cetera, speak French?
That is a great question. And the question I would ask Monet is like, how's your English? I don't know. All of his correspondence is in French.
Mm-hmm.
Hallowell, of course, spoke French. I'm not sure whether Bertha Palmer spoke French. I don't know. I know the Ryersons went to Giverny with one of Durand Ruel's sons. So they had a kind of interpreter, and also the artist Albert Andre was there. But I don't know. He spent time in London. He fled there during the Franco-Prussian War. That's where he met Durand Ruel, actually. They were all kind of expats a little bit in London while things were precarious in Paris. And he went back in 1900 and 1901, and he stayed at the Savoy Hotel. So I don't know if he was like ordering a drink in French or English. It's a great question.
And I think this will probably be our last question here. Jill wants to know, during this pandemic period, what types of research and planning have you been able to do?
Good question. Everybody's had to adjust, of course. The biggest adjustment, I think, is being far from the objects. But we are working on exhibitions through 2025, if you can believe it. So coming down the pipe is a Cézanne retrospective, which is very exciting, with Tate in London. I'm also working on a Camille Claudel exhibition, a female sculptor, which will be great. There's a Van Gogh project in the works, and lots of other exciting stuff coming down the line. So I will say we're doing, like everybody, so many Zooms across different time zones, and we meet with the paintings conservators there in the lab at the painting, and we're all trying to look together. So everybody's doing the best that they can, and the show kind of must go on.
Well, anytime you have time to come back to the Glencoe Library, we would love to have you.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thank you. It was a lovely presentation.
Oh, thanks. All right. Be well, everybody. Stay safe. Have a nice holiday.
Good night.
Good night.